I wasn't supposed to be home that early. Emily wouldn't have expected me for at least another 3 hours. When I walked through the door, everything seemed normal at first glance. But then I saw it, her laptop left open on the kitchen counter. Emily never left her devices out in the open, not since she started guarding them like state secrets. The screen was still glowing, a messaging app open. One message caught my attention immediately: "I can't wait to see you tonight. Room 312, usual spot." My eyes scanned the conversation, and every word felt like a knife. This wasn't the first time. My wife, the woman I had built my life with for over 25 years, was meeting another man. I didn't slam the laptop shut. I didn't yell or throw things. That's what weak men do, they let their emotions take control. Instead, I grabbed my phone, snapped a photo of the conversation, and walked out the door without a sound. This wasn't going to end with a confrontation full of empty threats. I wasn't about to cry or beg. I had given her everything, my loyalty, my love, my name, and she threw it all away. The hotel wasn't far. A cheap, sleazy place that reeked of desperation. I parked my car a block away and walked toward it, my steps measured, my mind focused. If she wanted chaos, I would show her the full weight of what chaos really felt like. At the front desk, I didn't bother with small talk. "Room 312, I said, slipping a crisp $100 bill across the counter. The clerk hesitated for a moment, then handed me a spare key. Money talks louder than excuses. When I reached the door, I didn't hesitate. I planted my boot squarely against the wood and kicked. The lock shuddered, the door flew open, and there they were, Emily and her lover. She gasped, scrambling to cover herself with a sheet, her face a mask of panic. The man, shirtless and stunned, froze like a deer in headlights. I didn't care about their excuses. I pulled out my phone and started recording, capturing every detail of their betrayal. "Keep smiling," I said coldly. "This is going to be the highlight of your pathetic lives." The man tried to stammer out an apology, but I silenced him with a glare. "You'll both pay for this," I said, my voice steady as steel. "Not now. But soon. You think I'm weak because I didn't yell? Because I didn't fight you here? That's your first mistake." I walked out without another word, leaving the door wide open for anyone in the hallway to see. Weak men cry over betrayal. Strong men turn it into fuel. Driving back home, I replayed the scene in my head. Emily's panicked face, the sheer disbelief in her lover's eyes, they didn't expect me to act. They thought they could hide their little escapades behind lies and secrecy, that I'd be too blind or too passive to notice. But that's the problem with cheaters, they mistake kindness for weakness. When I got home, the first thing I did was open my laptop. Evidence is power, and I wasn't about to let Emily talk her way out of this. The recording from the hotel room was crystal clear, capturing every incriminating word. I uploaded the video to a secure drive and backed it up twice. Next, I went through our finances. Joint accounts, credit cards, savings, it all needed to be locked down. By morning, she wouldn't have access to a single dollar. I contacted my bank and froze the accounts. Her name was still on some of them, but my authorization was primary. She wouldn't be able to touch a cent without my approval. Emily didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. When someone gets caught like that, they usually seek comfort in the arms of the person who helped destroy everything. That was fine by me. It gave me time to prepare for what came next. By sunrise, I'd made 3 calls. First, to my lawyer, to start divorce proceedings immediately. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations, I'd save the juicy details for the courtroom. Second, to a private investigator I'd worked with years ago during a business dispute. His job was simple: find everything he could about Emily's lover. Where he worked, who he associated with, and whether this wasn't the first time he'd played this game. The third call was to her parents. "I'm sure she hasn't told you yet," I began, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Emily was caught with another man last night. I'm filing for divorce." Her mother stammered something about being shocked, about how Emily would never do that, but I cut her off. "I'm only calling because I wanted you to hear it from me. If she tells you something different, you should know that I have evidence. This isn't up for debate." I ended the call before they could respond. That afternoon, Emily finally called. I stared at her name flashing on my phone for a moment before answering. "Adam," her voice was trembling, weak. "Please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," I said coldly. "You chose to destroy what we built. Now you can live with the consequences." "But it wasn't like that." "I made a mistake, Adam. Please, let's talk this through." Her desperation was pathetic. "You didn't just make a mistake, Emily. You made a decision. Over and over again. Now, I've made mine." She started crying, but I didn't let it sway me. Emotions were her weapon, and I refused to give her the satisfaction. "I've already contacted my lawyer," I continued. "You'll receive the papers soon. Don't bother coming home. Your things will be packed and waiting for you on the porch." The line went silent, and I knew she was realizing just how serious I was. "You can't do this," she whispered. "Watch me," I replied before hanging up. When I returned home later that day, I went straight to work. Every trace of her was removed from the house. Clothes, photos, jewelry, it all went into boxes. I placed them neatly on the front porch, like delivering a package she never wanted. That evening, I sent her a text with a single photo of the boxes and a note: "Your things are waiting for you. Don't step inside. The locks have been changed." I wasn't done yet. I forwarded the recording from the hotel to my lawyer and private investigator. The PI had already uncovered something interesting: her lover wasn't just some random fling. He had a history of seducing married women, often ones with money. Emily wasn't even his first relationship this year. This wasn't just about Emily's betrayal anymore. It was about dismantling the life of the man who thought he could ruin mine. By morning, the house was silent, too silent for a home that once buzzed with warmth and familiarity. I sat at the dining table, the weight of the previous night hanging in the air like a storm that had yet to break. Emily's betrayal wasn't just a crack in our marriage, it was an earthquake that had shattered its foundation. But I didn't dwell on the pain. Pain was useless if you didn't turn it into power. I opened my laptop and reviewed the evidence again. The recording from the hotel was clear: her voice, his voice, their laughter, every word. I filed the footage away securely, ensuring it was backed up in multiple places. This wasn't just about keeping proof, it was about control. Emily couldn't deny what was now irrefutable. My phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the stillness. It was from the investigator. Derek Cole, the name I'd been waiting to hear. The file attached to the message was detailed, and every line of text made my jaw tighten. Derek wasn't just another man caught in the throes of a bad decision. He was a predator. A man who targeted married women, using charm and manipulation to insert himself into their lives. He had a pattern, and Emily was simply his latest conquest. What made it worse was his arrogance. His social media accounts were a shrine to his vanity, filled with photos of expensive watches, tailored suits, and captions about earning what you deserve. He had no idea that his carefully curated life was about to collapse. I started with his career. Derek worked as a sales executive for a regional tech company that prided itself on its family-friendly image. A quick call to a friend in corporate HR provided me with the direct email addresses I needed. I drafted a message, attaching screenshots of his messages with Emily, the hotel photos, and a transcript of their recorded conversation. My note was brief: Derek Cole has been engaging in inappropriate relationships with married clients. Attached is evidence of his behavior. I trust your company will handle this appropriately. I sent it anonymously, but I knew the impact would be immediate. Companies like his couldn't afford a scandal, and Derek's position was too public to sweep this under the rug. But I wasn't done. Reputation isn't just destroyed in the workplace. It's dismantled socially, piece by piece. I compiled the same evidence and sent it to the spouses of several women Derek had been seen with at networking events. If he wanted to build a life on lies, I'd make sure every pillar of that life crumbled. The day passed in a blur of controlled actions. Emily hadn't come home, and I wasn't surprised. She was probably hiding with Derek, thinking that this storm would pass, that I would cool down and things could return to normal. Normal was gone. In the evening, her car pulled into the driveway. I didn't move from the couch as the sound of her footsteps approached the door. When the knock came, I let it hang in the air for a moment before standing. When I opened the door, I didn't give her a chance to speak. "What do you want?" She looked at me, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red. "Adam, please, I need to explain." "There's nothing to explain," I interrupted, my voice cold and even. "You made your choices. Now live with them. Just give me a chance to." "No," I said sharply. "You gave him the chances. You made the decisions. I've made mine." Her lip trembled, but I refused to let her theatrics sway me. "Your things are on the porch," I said, pointing to the neatly stacked boxes. "Take them and leave. The locks have been changed, and the divorce is already in motion. You'll hear from my lawyer soon." For a moment, she just stood there, as if waiting for me to change my mind. But I wasn't that man anymore. Without another word, I shut the door and locked it. I didn't stop to dwell on what had just happened. Instead, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and returned to my laptop. The private investigator had sent another update. Derek's personal life was just as fragile as his professional one. He was engaged to a woman named Rachel, and while I didn't know her personally, I knew she deserved the truth. It took less than 5 minutes to draft the email. I attached the same evidence I had sent to his company and added a note: "You don't know me, but you need to know the man you're engaged to. Attached is proof of what he's been doing. I thought you'd want to see this before making any life-altering decisions." I clicked send and leaned back in my chair. Derek thought he could manipulate and take from others without consequences. He was wrong. The morning air was crisp as I stood on the back porch, sipping black coffee and staring into the horizon. The chaos of the past few days had stripped away the illusions I'd clung to for years. Emily's betrayal wasn't just a crack in our marriage, it was proof that I had let things slip too far. I wasn't a man who wallowed in self-pity. Life's punches had taught me one lesson above all: you either hit back harder or stay on the ground. Emily and Derek had chosen chaos, and now I'd show them what real consequences looked like. By midday, my lawyer had prepared the first round of divorce papers. They were airtight, ensuring Emily couldn't claim a cent more than the law allowed. Infidelity wasn't just a moral failure, it had legal repercussions, and I intended to use every advantage. "File these as soon as she's served," I told him, my tone calm but firm. My lawyer nodded. "With this level of documentation, she doesn't stand a chance." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. Next, I turned my attention back to Derek. The investigator's latest update had been waiting in my inbox since dawn. I opened the file, skimming through its contents. Derek's carefully constructed life was crumbling. His fiancée, Rachel, had confronted him the night before, and it didn't go well. According to the report, she'd left their shared apartment in tears. Good. But I wasn't done. A man like Derek thrived on manipulation, on the belief that he could outsmart anyone. He needed to learn what it felt like to be cornered with no escape. I made a few calls to contacts in the local business community. Derek's industry relied heavily on reputation and networking, and I had every intention of dismantling both. Within hours, rumors about his behavior started circulating. Nothing official, just whispers among colleagues and associates. It was only a matter of time before the walls closed in. That evening, I sent another email to Derek's company. This time, I included the investigators' findings about his past indiscretions, financial irregularities, inappropriate relationships, and a pattern of deceit. I knew corporate policies like the back of my hand, and there was no way they'd let a man like Derek stay employed once this came to light. Emily called again that night. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice strained and desperate. "Adam, please, just talk to me. We can fix this." I was stupid, but it doesn't have to end like this. I deleted the message without listening to the rest. Fixing things wasn't an option. Not now, not ever. Instead, I drafted an email to Rachel, Derek's fiancée. She deserved to know the full extent of his actions, not just the surface-level betrayal. I attached the additional evidence the investigator had uncovered, along with a short message. "Rachel, I know this must be overwhelming, but you should know exactly who Derek is. This isn't just about what happened with my wife. His behavior runs deeper, and you deserve the full truth. I've attached more evidence for your review. Take care of yourself. Adam." I hit send and leaned back in my chair. Rachel was free to make her own decisions, but I suspected she'd already seen enough to understand that Derek's world was built on lies. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a new notification. Derek's company had responded to my latest email. "Mr. Anonymous, thank you for providing this additional information. A thorough review is underway. Your concerns are being taken seriously." The wheels were turning, and I knew it wouldn't be long before Derek faced the fallout. Later that day, I drove to the house Emily and I had shared for over 25 years. The memories we'd built there felt distant now, like echoes of another life. I pulled up to the driveway and saw her car parked outside. She was waiting for me, standing by the porch with a pleading expression. I stepped out of the car and approached, my footsteps deliberate. "Adam," she began, but I cut her off. "Save it," I said coldly. "You've already said enough." She flinched but didn't back away. "I just need a chance to explain." "There's nothing to explain," I interrupted. "You lied. You schemed. And you thought I wouldn't find out." Her voice broke as she spoke. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was lonely, Anne." "Stop," I snapped. "Don't insult me with excuses. You didn't accidentally meet him. You didn't accidentally end up in that hotel room. Everything you did was a choice. And now you'll face the consequences." Her tears flowed freely now, but they didn't move me. I pointed to the pile of boxes still sitting on the porch. "Take your things and go," I said, my voice sharp. "The locks have been changed. You have no place here anymore." For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then the reality of the situation seemed to hit her. She turned and began loading the boxes into her car without another word. As I watched her drive away, I felt no regret. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. By the following morning, the gears of my plan were turning at full speed. Derek's reputation was in free fall, Emily was out of my life, and yet, I felt no satisfaction. There was still work to be done. Men like Derek relied on their charm and deceit to slither through life, leaving destruction in their wake. If I wanted this to end, I had to ensure there was no path forward for him to recover. I started the day with a call to my private investigator. He answered on the second ring, his voice brisk but professional. "Morning, Adam. I assume you've seen the latest updates?" "I have," I replied. "But I need more. Derek's company is already investigating him, and his fiancée knows the truth." "What about his connections?" Who else can we bring into the light? There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of papers shuffling. I've been digging into his professional network. He's got a handful of key clients, small business owners mostly, but there's one name that stands out, our local nonprofit. They've been a significant client for years. He's been handling their fundraising campaigns. Send me the details, I said. The email came through within minutes, containing everything I needed, the nonprofit's name, its director, and contact information. It didn't take long for me to draft a message, attaching the same evidence I'd already sent to Derek's company. But this time, I framed it differently. Dear Director, I'm reaching out regarding Derek Cole. As someone entrusted with managing sensitive accounts, his behavior outside of work raises serious ethical concerns. Please see the attached materials and determine if this is the type of individual you want representing your organization. Sincerely, a concerned citizen. I hit send and leaned back in my chair. Nonprofits thrived on trust, and Derek's indiscretions would ripple through his professional relationships like cracks in a dam. Later that morning, my phone buzzed with another notification. This time, it was from Derek's fiancée, Rachel. Her message was short but cutting. Thank you for sending everything. Derek's things are packed, and he'll be out by tonight. I never want to hear his name again. I couldn't help but smirk. Derek's personal life was crumbling as quickly as his professional one, but the satisfaction was fleeting. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about ensuring that neither he nor Emily could hurt anyone else the way they had hurt me. By mid-afternoon, I received a call from Derek's company. I recognized the HR director's voice immediately, her tone professional but tense. Mr. She paused. Adam, is it? I understand you've been the one providing us with information regarding Derek Cole. That's correct, I said evenly. I can't share the specifics of our internal review, she continued, but I can assure you that appropriate action is being taken. We appreciate your vigilance in bringing this matter to our attention. She hung up before I could respond, but I didn't need confirmation. The fact that they'd reached out at all was enough to tell me Derek's days at the company were numbered. That evening, as I was reviewing more of the investigators' findings, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Emily. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. Adam, she began, her voice hesitant. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to talk to you. You've got 2 minutes, I said flatly. She paused, likely thrown off by my lack of emotion. I wanted to apologize. For everything. I know I hurt you, and I know I can't undo what I've done, but... Stop, I interrupted. You not calling to apologize. You calling because you realizing how badly you've messed up. Her silence told me I was right. You threw away 25 years, Emily, I continued. For what? A man who's losing everything faster than you can pack your things? You made your bed. Now lie in it. Adam, please, she whispered. I don't want to lose everything. You already have, I said coldly. The house, the finances, the life we built, it's all gone. And that's on you. I hung up without waiting for her response. Whatever regrets she had now were meaningless. Regret didn't undo betrayal. The following day, I received another email, this time from the nonprofit Derek had worked with. Dear Sir, thank you for bringing this to our attention. After reviewing the materials you provided, we have decided to terminate our relationship with Mr. Cole. We take ethical concerns very seriously and appreciate your vigilance. That was the final nail in Derek's coffin. His professional network was unraveling, and with it, his ability to manipulate others. I poured myself a drink that night, reflecting on how quickly the tide had turned. Derek had thought he was untouchable, and Emily had thought she could live a double life without consequences. They were both wrong. But I wasn't done. One last move remained, a way to ensure that their betrayal would haunt them long after I moved on. The emptiness of the house wasn't just physical now, it was emotional, almost tangible. As I boxed up the last few belongings, the memories I once cherished now felt like weights I needed to cast off. Every picture frame, every keepsake, seemed tainted by the lies Emily had woven into our lives. I placed the final box in the car, the sound of the trunk closing like punctuation at the end of a long, painful sentence. The house was sold. The papers were signed. But I knew my work wasn't finished. Derek had been trying to reach me. He'd sent messages through social media, left voicemails, all of them ignored. Until now. The cafe he chose was a small, quiet spot on the edge of downtown. I arrived 10 minutes early, as always, and chose a seat in the far corner where I could see every entrance and exit. Derek arrived 5 minutes late, his tie loosened and his face drawn. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, and I took satisfaction in that. "Adam," he said, attempting a smile as he approached. I didn't respond, didn't gesture for him to sit. He hesitated before finally lowering himself into the seat across from me. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet," he began, his voice strained. "Spit it out," I said, folding my arms across my chest. Derek fidgeted, his fingers drumming on the edge of the table. "Look, this has all gone too far. I've lost my job, Rachel's left me. I'm just asking you to back off, okay? Enough damage has been done." I let the silence hang between us, watching him squirm under my gaze. "You think this is about damage?" I said finally. "It's..." "Stop talking," I snapped. "You thought you could walk into my life, destroy my marriage, and face no consequences? You thought you could steal, manipulate, and lie your way through the world without paying the price?" His face flushed, and for a moment, I saw the man he really was, not confident, not charming, but desperate. "I've lost everything," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What more do you want from me?" I leaned forward, my tone cold. "I don't want anything from you, Derek. This isn't about what I want. This is about making sure you can't do this to anyone else." He opened his mouth to respond, but I stood before he could speak. "We're done here," I said, my voice final. "Enjoy the life you've made for yourself, what's left of it." I walked out of the cafe without looking back. That evening, I sat in the empty living room of the house I was about to leave behind. The walls that had once held laughter and love now seemed to echo with silence. I poured a glass of bourbon and stared out the window, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. My phone buzzed beside me. It was an email from Derek's former employer. "Mr. Adam. We wanted to inform you that following our investigation, Derek Cole is no longer employed with our company. We appreciate your diligence in bringing this matter to light." I set the phone down, the weight in my chest lifting slightly. Derek's professional life was over, and his personal life was in ruins. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. The following morning, I received another message. This one was from Rachel. "Adam. I can't thank you enough for opening my eyes. Derek's out of my life for good, and I feel like I've finally escaped a nightmare I didn't even know I was living. You didn't just help me, you saved me." I stared at the message for a long time. Rachel didn't owe me gratitude, but her words brought a sense of closure I hadn't expected. By midday, the house was officially no longer mine. I handed the keys to Sarah, the real estate agent, and watched as she locked the front door for the last time. "New beginnings," she said, smiling. "Something like that," I replied. As I drove away, the weight of the past weeks began to lift. Emily and Derek had made their choices, and they had paid the price. The future was mine to shape now, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace it. The motel room was as unremarkable as it was temporary, beige walls, a creaky bed, and a window that rattled slightly whenever a car passed on the road outside. It was the kind of place where people stopped when they didn't have anywhere else to go, and for now, that suited me just fine. My things were packed in a couple of duffel bags stacked neatly by the door. Everything else, the house, the furniture, even the memories I didn't want to hold on to, had been left behind. It felt strange, stepping into a world where nothing was familiar, but it also felt clean. That morning, I decided I wasn't going to sit in that room and wait for clarity to find me. If I wanted a fresh start, I had to go looking for it. I drove out of town, following the backroads that twisted through the countryside. It wasn't long before I came across a small roadside stand selling fresh produce and homemade pies. The sign was painted by hand, the letters slightly crooked, but it had a charm that made me pull over. The woman behind the stand greeted me with a warm smile. "Morning. You passing through?" "Something like that," I replied, glancing at the rows of baskets filled with apples and peaches. "This all from your farm?" She nodded. "Third generation. My grandfather planted the first orchard back in the 1940s. You don't see a lot of those still running these days." Her voice carried a quiet pride, and for a moment, I envied her. She belonged to this place in a way I hadn't felt connected to anything in years. I bought a bag of peaches and a small apple pie, thinking it might make for a decent meal later. As I got back into my car, I realized I hadn't felt this relaxed in weeks. Later, I found myself in a park at the edge of a small lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a mirror, and I sat on a bench nearby, letting the quiet seep into me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about Emily or Derek. I wasn't replaying conversations in my head or planning my next move. I was just being. A jogger passed by, nodding in greeting, and I nodded back. Simple things. Normal things. When I got back to the motel that evening, I saw an old pickup truck parked near my room. The hood was up, and a man in his late 60s was tinkering with the engine. "Need a hand?" I asked, approaching. He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Nah, just giving her a little love. She's temperamental, but she gets me where I need to go." We struck up a conversation, and I learned his name was Henry. He'd been a mechanic most of his life, though he'd slowed down in recent years. "Not much call for an old grease monkey these days," he joked. When I mentioned I was looking for work, not seriously, just to fill the silence, his eyes lit up. "You any good with your hands?" he asked. "I can hold my own," I replied. "Well, if you're not picky, I could use a second pair now and then. Nothing big, oil changes, brake pads, the kind of stuff these young bucks think is beneath them." It wasn't what I had expected to find, but something about the offer felt right. The next day, I showed up at Henry's garage. It was a modest place, tucked behind a gas station off the main road. The walls were lined with tools and parts, and the air smelled like oil and metal. "Didn't think you'd actually come," Henry said, handing me a pair of gloves. "Figured I'd see what you've got," I replied. We spent the day working on a beat-up sedan that had seen better years. Henry was patient, explaining things without a hint of condescension, and by the end of it, I realized I'd enjoyed myself. That evening, as I drove back to the motel, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, a purpose. It wasn't grand or life-changing, but it was real. The days at Henry's garage began to form a rhythm, one that I hadn't realized I needed. Each morning, I arrived just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, the air still crisp from the night before. Henry would already be there, sipping coffee from a battered thermos and tinkering with some project he'd started hours earlier. "You early," he said one morning as I walked in, though there was no judgment in his tone. "Old habits," I replied, pulling on the gloves he'd loaned me my first day. It wasn't glamorous work, but there was something grounding about it. We replaced brake pads, patched tires, changed oil, the kind of small, tangible tasks that left you with a clear sense of accomplishment. Henry wasn't much for small talk, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. "You've got a good head for this," he said one afternoon as we worked on an old pickup that refused to start. "Didn't think I'd enjoy it as much as I do," I admitted, tightening a bolt under the hood. He gave a small grunt of approval. "Funny how life works. Sometimes the things you don't expect end up being exactly what you need." I didn't respond, but his words stuck with me. One evening, as we closed up shop, Henry leaned against the counter, his hands smudged with grease. "You not from around here, are you?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. "No," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Just passing through." "Looks to me like you've been here long enough to be more than passing through." I looked at him, trying to gauge if there was more to his comment. But Henry didn't press. He just gave me a knowing look before heading out to his truck. That weekend, I decided to visit the farmer's market again. Something about the simple charm of it had stayed with me, and I found myself wanting to feel that sense of connection again. The woman from the roadside stand was there, rearranging baskets of peaches and apples. She recognized me immediately. "You back," she said with a smile. "Needed another pie," I joked, though it wasn't far from the truth. She handed me one, wrapped in wax paper and tied with twine. "You look like you've been working hard." "Something like that," I said. "Helping out at a garage in town." "Henry's place?" she asked, her eyebrows raising slightly. I nodded. "Yeah, you know him?" "Everyone knows Henry," she said. "Good man. He doesn't take to people easily, so if he's keeping you around, you must be doing something right." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just thanked her for the pie and walked on. Back at the motel, I opened the pie and ate a slice while sitting on the edge of the bed. It wasn't just a good pie, it was the kind of thing that reminded you of home, even if you didn't have one anymore. I thought about what the woman had said. Henry keeping me around. The truth was, I hadn't thought about it that way. I was just doing the work, trying to keep my hands busy and my mind from drifting too far into the past. But maybe there was more to it. The next day at the garage, Henry had me start on a job by myself, replacing the alternator in an old sedan. "You've seen me do it enough times," he said. "Now it's your turn." I was halfway through the job when a customer came in, a woman in her early 40s with a calm demeanor and a sharp eye. "Henry," she said, glancing over at me, "you've got a new hand?" "Something like that," he replied. She smiled and walked over, extending a hand. "I'm Meredith. I run the bookstore downtown." "Adam," I said, shaking her hand. She lingered for a moment, watching me work. "You any good?" "Getting there," I said, and she laughed. Meredith left with a promise to return, and as she drove away, Henry gave me a sidelong glance. "She's trouble," he said with a smirk. "Why is that?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Owns too many books. You'll be carrying boxes if you aren't careful." I laughed, the sound surprising me. That evening, I went back to the motel and called the woodworker I'd met at the farmer's market. "I'm ready for that desk," I said. "Good," he replied. "Got the measurements?" I gave him the details, and he promised to have it done within a week. As I hung up, I realized how much had changed in just a short time. The motel wasn't home, the garage wasn't a career, and yet, for the first time in months, I felt like I had a foundation. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. By the time the weekend rolled around, the days at the garage felt like second nature. My hands were calloused from hours of work, and my mind, for the first time in months, was quiet. Henry had a way of keeping things simple, no endless chatter, no unnecessary questions. But as much as I wanted to leave the past behind, there were loose ends I couldn't ignore. Derek might have been dealt with, but the memories of Emily's betrayal still lingered like a shadow at the edges of my mind. Closure wasn't just something I could hope for, it was something I needed to make happen. Saturday afternoon, I finished up an oil change and cleaned off my hands with a rag. "Henry," I'm taking the rest of the day, I said. He didn't look up from the carburetor he was working on. Finally realized you're allowed to have a life? Something like that, I replied. I got into my car and drove without a clear destination. I'd learned long ago that sometimes the best way to clear your mind was to let the road decide where to take you. But this time, the road seemed to know exactly where I needed to go. It wasn't until I pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe just outside town that I realized where I was. This was the place Emily and I used to go on Sunday mornings, back when things between us felt normal. I hadn't been here in years. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods hit me as I walked inside, triggering a rush of memories I wasn't sure I wanted to face. I ordered a black coffee and sat in the corner booth we always used to claim as our own. As I stared out the window, I thought about the last few weeks. I had cut Emily out of my life, severing ties as cleanly as I could. But there were questions I'd never asked, things I hadn't confronted because I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answers. That's when I made the decision. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found her number. For a moment, I hesitated. But then, with a deep breath, I pressed the call button. It rang twice before she picked up. "Adam," Emily said, her voice hesitant. "It's me," I replied. There was a pause, the kind that felt like it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said to each other. "I didn't expect to hear from you," she said finally. "I need answers," I said, my tone firm. "Not excuses, not apologies. Just the truth." Another pause. "I'll meet you." "Where are you?" I gave her the address of the cafe, and 15 minutes later, she walked through the door. She looked different, thinner, more tired. The confident air she used to carry had been replaced by something else, something quieter. She sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she must have ordered on the way in. "What do you want to know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward, my gaze steady. "Why?" Emily flinched, as if the question had caught her off guard. "It's not as simple as you think." "Try me," I said. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I was lost. For a long time. You were always so focused on work, on making sure everything was perfect. And I felt invisible." "That's your excuse?" I snapped. "You felt invisible, so you decided to destroy everything we built?" "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice rising. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did." "That's a lie, and you know it," I shot back. "Affairs don't just happen, Emily. You made a choice. Over and over again." Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. "You don't understand." "You're right," I interrupted. "I don't understand. I don't understand how someone can throw away 25 years for a man who didn't even stick around after the fallout." Emily looked down at her cup, unable to meet my gaze. "I regret it," she said softly. "Every day." "Regret doesn't fix anything," I replied. "It doesn't undo the damage." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between us. Finally, Emily spoke. "Are you happy now?" she asked, her voice trembling. I thought about the garage, about the farmer's market, about Clara and Henry and the little pieces of a new life I was starting to build. "I'm getting there," I said. She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I hope you find it." I stood, tossing a few bills on the table to cover the coffee. "Take care of yourself, Emily." As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was no satisfaction in confronting her, no sense of victory. But there was closure. And that was enough. That evening, I returned to the motel and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the card the woodworker had given me. Slowly, I picked up the phone and dialed his number. "I'm ready for that desk," I said when he answered. Good, he replied. Got the measurements? As we finalized the details, I realized something. The life I had known was gone, but the one I was building now was entirely my own. The motel room felt different that night. Maybe it was the weight of the conversation with Emily, or maybe it was something else. The bed was the same, the air still carried the faint scent of old wood and stale detergent, but there was a sense of finality in the room. I stared at the desk where I'd left the divorce papers, now signed and waiting for the lawyer's final approval. Everything I'd been holding onto, anger, bitterness, regret, seemed smaller now, like a heavy coat I no longer needed to wear. But the future still felt uncertain, a blank canvas with too many possibilities. For the first time in months, I didn't know what my next move would be. The next morning, I arrived at Henry's garage, the smell of oil and gasoline greeting me like an old friend. Henry was already there, of course, wiping down a set of tools with meticulous care. "You late," he said without looking up, though I wasn't. "Traffic," I replied with a smirk, tossing my bag onto a nearby bench. We worked in comfortable silence, the sound of wrenches and ratchets filling the air. Around midday, a familiar face walked in. It was Meredith, the bookstore owner I'd met a few days earlier. "Car trouble again?" Henry asked, though his tone was more amused than concerned. "Not this time," Meredith replied, smiling as she glanced at me. "I came to see if your new guy was as good as you claimed." Henry grunted, clearly unimpressed. "He's still got a ways to go, but he's holding up." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. Meredith stayed longer than necessary, chatting about her shop and the upcoming book fair in town. Before she left, she handed me a small flyer. "You should stop by," she said. "It's this Saturday. Lots of good people, good food. You might like it." I tucked the flyer into my pocket, unsure if I'd actually go. That evening, as I sat in the motel room, the flyer still sitting on the nightstand, I thought about what Meredith had said. Good people. Good food. It was such a simple invitation, but it carried a weight I hadn't expected. For months, my life had been defined by endings: the end of my marriage, the end of the life I thought I'd built, the end of the person I used to be. But maybe it was time to start looking for beginnings. Saturday came quicker than I'd expected, and I found myself standing outside the bookstore, the flyer still clutched in my hand. The street was bustling with people, vendors lining the sidewalks with booths selling everything from homemade jams to second-hand books. Meredith spotted me almost immediately. "You made it," she said, her smile genuine. "Figured I'd see what all the fuss was about," I replied. She gave me a quick tour of the fair, introducing me to other shop owners and locals. There was an easy warmth to the way she moved through the crowd, like she belonged here in a way I hadn't felt I belonged anywhere in years. At one point, I found myself at a booth selling leather-bound journals. The vendor, an older woman with a kind smile, gestured toward a stack of plain black books. "Writing's good for the soul," she said. "Helps you make sense of things." I bought one, though I wasn't sure I'd use it. As the sun began to set, the crowd thinned, and the fair took on a quieter, more intimate atmosphere. Meredith found me near the food trucks, holding 2 cups of hot cider. "Thought you might need a refill," she said, handing me one. "Thanks," I replied, taking a sip. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. "I didn't think you'd come," she said finally. "Neither did I admitted. Meredith glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, showing up is the hardest part." That night, as I sat back in the motel room, the journal resting on the desk, I thought about what she'd said. Showing up. It sounded simple, but it carried more weight than I'd realized. I opened the journal and stared at the first blank page for a long time before finally picking up a pen. "This is where it starts," I wrote. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the motel room, painting the walls in muted shades of orange and gold. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the journal I'd bought the night before. The cover was smooth, the pages crisp, untouched. For a long time, I just stared at it, turning it over in my hands. Writing had never been something I leaned on. I was the type to keep things inside, to bury them deep and let time do the work of healing. But time hadn't done its job this time around. Maybe that's why I'd picked up the journal, to give myself a chance to make sense of everything in a way I hadn't before. I flipped it open to the first page and stared at the blank lines. By the time I left the motel and arrived at Henry's garage, the sun was already high in the sky. Henry was working on an old sedan, his radio playing a low hum of country music in the background. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a pair of gloves. The work was routine: brake pads, oil changes, a stubborn engine that wouldn't start. It didn't require much thought, which gave my mind room to wander. During a break, I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that hinted at the first days of fall. I leaned against the side of the garage, watching the traffic on the main road. "Something on your mind?" Henry's voice broke the silence. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, a rag slung over his shoulder. "Just thinking," I said. He walked over, leaning against the wall beside me. "That's dangerous." I laughed, a dry sound. "Maybe. But I've got a lot to think about." Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Whatever it is, don't let it keep you stuck. Life's too short for that." I didn't respond, but his words stuck with me. That evening, I drove out to the lake I'd found a few weeks earlier. The water was calm, the surface rippling gently in the fading light. I parked the car and walked down to the edge, the cool grass brushing against my shoes. I pulled the journal from my jacket pocket and opened it, the blank pages staring back at me. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure of where to start. But then, I thought about everything: Emily, Derek, the house, the life I'd left behind. I started writing. The words came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling onto the page in uneven lines. I wrote about the betrayal, the anger, the sense of loss that had followed me like a shadow. I wrote about the nights I'd spent awake, replaying conversations, wondering what I could have done differently. But then, I wrote about the garage, about the farmer's market, about Meredith's easy laugh and Henry's quiet wisdom. I wrote about the small moments that had started to make life feel manageable again. When I finally looked up, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The next morning, I returned to the garage feeling lighter. Henry noticed immediately. "Someone's in a good mood," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Just had a good night," I replied. He didn't press, which I appreciated. Instead, he handed me a set of keys. "Take this out for a spin," he said, nodding toward the sedan we'd been working on the day before. It wasn't a test, not really. It was Henry's way of showing trust, of saying I'd earned my place here. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the familiar hum of a well-tuned motor filling the air. As I drove down the quiet backroads, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. That evening, I found myself back at the cafe where I'd met Meredith. She wasn't there, but the familiar atmosphere was enough. I ordered a coffee and pulled out the journal, flipping through the pages I'd already filled. There was still so much I didn't know about the future, so many questions left unanswered. But for the first time, it didn't feel overwhelming. I picked up my pen and wrote, "It doesn't happen all at once. But maybe, one step at a time, I'll get there." The garage felt unusually quiet that Friday morning. Henry had taken the day off, leaving me to finish up a few routine jobs on my own. The absence of his dry humor and steady presence gave me too much time to think, but maybe that was a good thing. The sedan we'd been working on was parked in the corner, polished and running like new. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, remembering the hours I'd poured into fixing its every flaw. It wasn't just a car anymore, It was proof of something I hadn't realized I'd needed to see. I could rebuild. By mid-afternoon, I'd locked up the garage and started driving aimlessly. The sedan handled smoothly, its engine purring like a contented cat. I rolled the windows down, letting the cool breeze carry the sense of fall, dry leaves, distant smoke, the faint hint of rain. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my hands seemed to know where to go. The lake appeared on the horizon before I realized I'd driven toward it. Parking near the edge, I stepped out and took a deep breath. The water was calm, a mirror reflecting the gray clouds gathering above. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of everything I'd been through. Emily and Derek had been a storm, but storms pass, and I was still standing. I reached into the car and grabbed the journal from the passenger seat. It had become an unexpected companion in recent weeks, its pages filling up with pieces of my story. Flipping to a blank page, I sat down on a rock near the water's edge and started writing. This lake feels different today. It's quieter, not because the world has changed, but because I have. The words flowed easily, a reflection of thoughts I hadn't realized were waiting to be voiced. That evening, as I drove back into town, I decided to stop by the bookstore. The lights inside were warm and inviting, a soft glow spilling onto the sidewalk. Meredith was behind the counter, organizing a new shipment of books. "Hey," she said, looking up as I walked in. "Hey," I replied, feeling a little out of place. She gestured toward the small coffee station in the corner. "Help yourself. We don't charge regulars." I laughed softly. "Regular, huh? Didn't realize I'd earned that title." "Well, you're here more than most," she teased. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "I'm leaving the motel soon," I said, surprising even myself. Meredith raised an eyebrow. "Big plans?" "I bought a place," I admitted. "Small, just outside town. Feels right, though." Her smile was genuine, a quiet warmth that made me feel unexpectedly seen. "Good for you, Adam. New starts are rare, you've got to make the most of them." The next morning, I stood on the porch of the cottage. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of cedar from the freshly sanded railing. The furniture inside was sparse, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like mine. In the small living room, the journal sat on the desk I'd ordered from the woodworker. The craftsmanship was flawless, sturdy and simple, just like I'd asked for. I opened the journal and flipped to the last page I'd written. The words stared back at me, a snapshot of who I'd been only weeks ago, angry, hurt, lost. Taking a pen, I turned to a fresh page and wrote, "The house is quiet, but it doesn't feel empty. For the first time, I don't feel like I'm missing something. I feel like I've found a place to start over. The past will always be part of me, but it doesn't have to define what comes next." I set the journal down and leaned back in the chair, looking out the window as the sun began to rise over the hills. The sky was a soft blend of orange and pink, the kind of quiet beauty you don't notice unless you stop long enough to really see it. That evening, I invited Henry over for dinner. He arrived with a six-pack of beer and a sarcastic comment about my cooking skills. "You sure this isn't a health hazard?" he joked as I set a plate of grilled steaks on the table. "I haven't killed anyone yet," I replied, pouring us both a drink. We ate in companionable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. As the evening wore on, Henry leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You doing all right, kid?" he said finally. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. When Henry left, I stood on the porch and watched as his truck disappeared down the dirt road. The stars were out now, scattered across the sky like pieces of a puzzle. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I could build. I went back inside, picked up the journal, and wrote one last line for the night. "It's not about starting over. It's about moving forward." I closed the journal, set it on the desk, and smiled. The past was behind me, and for the first time, the road ahead felt like mine to walk.